problems. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to graph a line given an equation using its slope and y-intercept. You should also be able to write an equation of a line given a graph. We want to graph the line 6x plus 5y equals 30. Now, in order to graph the line using the slope and the y-intercept, we need to begin first by rewriting the equation from standard form to slope-intercept form, meaning solve for y. So the first step towards solving for y is to subtract 6x from each side. Our next step then is to divide by 5. What you do to one side, you must do to the others, every one on each side. So once we simplify that, we have a line of y equals negative 6/5 x plus 6. We now know that our slope is negative 6/5, and we have a y-intercept in terms of its location on the rectangular coordinate system. Remember, it's always going to be a 0 in x's place, and the number that you see here behind the slope, the 6, that would be in y's place. That's why it's called the y-intercept. It's the point where it touches the y-axis. So our y-intercept is at 0, 6. Now we're going to use those two bits of information, the slope and the y-intercept, to graph our line. And we're going to do that on the next page. So step one, once we have our line in slope-intercept form, is to plot your y-intercept, which, as we see, it's 0, 6. So that would be 0 and up 6. Let's go ahead and plot that. There you go. Next, we're going to use our slope, which is negative 6/5, to rise and run to our next point on the line. Now, you should know by now that anytime you have a negative slope, that either your top or your bottom of your fraction is going to be negative, okay? Not both, one or the other. I'm going to use a negative on top instead of the bottom. And the reason for that, because our next step is we're going to, from that y-intercept, the first point that we just plotted, from that point, we're going to use our slope to rise and run to our next point on the line. And so you would either do a negative up top and a positive down below, such as you see here with the slope, or you could write it as a positive 6 on top and a negative 5 on the bottom. Now, if I were to write it as a positive 6 up top, that means from that point, the y-intercept, I would have to move up 6. And I just don't have the space here for this little small graph that we have on our screen. So that is why we chose to make the top negative so that we can fall down from that point. And that would mean that the bottom would have to be positive. So again, you should know by now that anytime your slope is negative, is that either the top is going to be negative or the bottom is going to be negative, not both. So now we're going to go ahead from the y-intercept, which is at 0, 6. We're going to fall down 6. Because since the rise is a negative, that means you're going to fall down. So from that point, we're going to fall down 6. And then we're going to run 5, because the bottom is a run. Since it's a positive number, we have to run to the positive side. So we're going to run 5 to the positive side. And that takes us to our next point on the line. And you simply draw a line through the 2 points. So again, just to go over the steps, because I've been talking through each step and I want to make sure you understand. Once you rewrite your equation in slope-intercept form and you're able to identify what the slope and the y-intercept is, step one is to plot your y-intercept, the point where it touches the y-axis. And then from that point, use your slope to rise and run to your next point on the line, because recall, you only need 2 points to plot a line. And once you get that second point, you just simply draw a line through there, and there you have it. You have your line graphed. In this example, we are asked to write an equation when we are given nothing more than just a graph. I'm going to show you how you can solve this using two different methods. Let's start with the first method. The first method is to simply take any 2 points on the line. Doesn't matter which point you take. I would suggest to take points that are what you would consider to be at a corner point, because they are whole numbers and not fractions. For example, here's a point where it is right in the corner or the intersection of that point. That's a whole number. For example, in the case right here, this would be considered a fraction. This would be considered a fraction because this one here is between 0 and 1. This would be a fraction. A lot of these are fractions, 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 fractions. We don't get to another whole number until up here at 3, 3. So my suggestion would be to use whole numbers, because it will be a lot easier when you're plugging them into the slope formula, since the slope formula itself is already in the form of a fraction. If you're using fractions and putting them in the form of a fraction, it can sometimes be confusing. So if at all possible, try to find whole numbers that you can plug in. So you're going to find any 2 points on a line, preferably whole numbers, and you're going to plug them into the slope formula, because recall, you can plug any 2 points of a line into the slope formula to find the slope of that line. So again, I'm going to choose whole number points. So the first point I chose was the 0 and down 2, and then the other point we used 3, 3, because I want to go ahead and plug in whole numbers. So when we plug those 2 points into the slope formula of y sub 2 minus y sub 1 over x sub 2 minus x sub 1, recall double negatives become positives, negative 2, but with the negative in front of it becomes plus 2, and that will leave us with a slope of 5/3. Once you know your slope, we also know the y-intercept, the point where it touches the y-axis, and it touches at 0, negative 2. And once you have your y-intercept, you can go ahead and write your line. Our line then would be y equals our m here, notice is 5/3. Our slope we just found out is 5/3, so that would be 5/3 x. And then putting the y-intercept of negative 2 in the back of it, your line would be y equals 5/3 x minus 2. So that's method one, is to simply pick any 2 points, preferably whole number points, plug them into the slope formula, find your slope, and then find your y-intercept, the point where it touches the y-axis, and put everything all together, and you have your line. Method two is you still find any 2 points on the line, preferably whole number points will be great, and then simply just rise and run from one point to the other point on the line. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to take one of the points and I'm going to move from there to go to the other point. I'm going to rise up 5 and run 3 to the other point. There I'm on the line. And that was a rise of 5, a run of 3. So there's my slope, 5/3. Again, the y-intercept is a point where it touches the y-axis, and it touches at 0, 2. When you put everything together, your line is y equals 5/3 x minus 2.